All right, one child policy today. Gonna write that at the top of your notes. All right. Let's see here. What was China's one-child policy? It's an attempt to decrease and stabilize the Chinese population. Okay. So that's how it's defined or described. Question is, how did China get to have such a high population in the first place? What was making their population growth, so exponential the second half of the 20th century? Anybody familiar with the reason why? Why would their population just start growing so much faster than everybody else's? Second half of the 20th century. So there was a graph in Hans's text, and it actually referred to the guy that was really behind the increase in birth rates in China. On that graph, it was talking about world deaths. And at the beginning of the 20th century, it had the Spanish flu, and then it dipped, right? Everybody's dying because of that. And then it got to 1940s, and it dipped because of World War II, right? And then it got to the 1960s, and then it dipped again. And then everybody's like, what went on in the 1960s that made this dip in world population? Yeah.
Wasn't it the Chinese, how everybody was starving?
Exactly. Right. So who's behind that? The guy named Mao. You guys heard of Mao? Mao Zedong, right? So the beginning of the 20th century, China's ending the dynasty rule, and they try out a republic. The republic doesn't work very well for them, and so it breaks out in a civil war. There's two guys that lead two factions in China in this civil war. There's Chiang Kai-shek, was on the nationalist side, and then there's Mao Zedong on the other side. He's the communist faction. Mao defeats Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek has to leave, and he flees the country, goes to Taiwan. You guys remember talking about the situation with Taiwan? Beijing government in China, they see Taiwan as a Chinese province. There's other people out there that sees Taiwan as a independent nation, sovereign nation on its own. Okay, well that goes all back to Chiang Kai-shek Mao. Okay, well when Mao introduced communism, one of the policies that he had in the second half of the 20th century was this idea of the Great Leap Forward, and trying to make China an economic giant. And one aspect of that policy was an influx of agriculture. So he took people away from their regular occupations and said, hey, we're all going to work together on agriculture to try to create this influx of food, right? But then some things happened that were outside of their control. Some of it was inside their control. You remember me telling you about that idea that they didn't like the idea of sparrows, and they thought that they were just nuisances, so they encouraged everybody to shoot them. And when they shot them, then what? They didn't realize they have an influx of bugs, and then that contributes to decreased crop yields. And then they had some droughts that was outside of their control as well. So they had some bad years of crops right in a row, bang, bang, bang. And then they didn't want to tell the government that they were not able to fulfill the demands that were the goals that they had set for themselves. And so what did they do? They forged the numbers, told the government that things were going well when actually things weren't going well, and then the common people were starving, and then they were dying. And that's what led to that big dip, right? So another aspect of Mao's Great Leap Forward program was an increase in population. He was saying if we're going to become a world giant, one of the best countries in the world, strongest countries economically in the world, we're going to have a big population. So he encouraged families to have many children. Okay? So throughout the 1950s and 60s, that took place. They were having very large families, and then their population began to grow so much that they had to backtrack. They said things are getting out of hand. Our population's getting too big. We don't have enough food to go around for everyone. We don't have enough resources to provide for everybody. We got to do something else. Okay? So the Great Leap Forward was kind of like the Great Leap Backward. So this graph, pretty cool graph seeing that it moves. But over here on the left-hand side, these are ages. So back in like the 1970s, you had a really small number of older people, but you get to the early 2000s, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it starts to taper off here, right? And the reason why it's tapering off is because the implementation of the one-child policy. So you can see it gets really big in some generations, age groups, and then it starts to drop, right? Now it becomes more stable that way, okay? So how many people live in China? Did we ask this question already? I said world population, right? But how many people live in China? 3.5 billion. So half the world's population lives in China?
Oh no.
Good try. Good try. It is a lot, right? But it's not half. 1.3 is the number we're going to use, okay? 1.3 billion people in China. India's got a fairly close population. I think the population growth is at a faster rate than what China has now because of the one-child policy. So it's probably going to surpass China here pretty soon. But 1.3 billion, to compare to other countries here in the United States, we have 300 million, approximately 300 million. So if we translate that to billion, that's 0.3 billion. So they have 1.3 billion, we have 0.3 billion. So how many more people do they have than we do? A lot. Specifically, they have how many more billion? One, thank you. All right. They have 1 billion more people than we do. Right? That's a lot of people. I usually think about it this way. I know that intelligence varies from culture to culture, and ingenuity and creativity varies, but we think we have a lot of smart people here in the United States, right? Of our 300 million people. Inevitably, what's going to happen in China? They've got to have smart people. Well, I'm not sure if it's necessarily smarter, but they've got a larger number of smart people that way. Yeah, Miss Coffin.
This might be a dumb question, but if family has like 2 kids, so they kill the other one.
So we'll get to
What
that.
do they do?
We'll get to that scenario here in a little bit. Getting ahead of ourselves just a little bit, okay? So, why did China adopt this policy, the one-child policy? They did it for 3 reasons. They wanted to decrease poverty and starvation levels, right? Get rid of that dip in the graph that we were referring to before. Increase standard of living, and then help out the economy. So if we do some self-reflection right now, think about China today. Have they decreased poverty and starvation levels? Do you see another dip in the graph? No, the dip's gone, right? So poverty and starvation levels, they may still have a little bit of that, but for the most part, it's much, much better in China today than what it used to be in the 1960s, 1950s, 60s, 70s, okay? Increased standard of living, has it done that? Yeah, it's done that quite a bit, right? They are reveling in this new, economic environment that they've established in China where there's a lot of money, right? And they can, live cushy lives, cushier lives than what they used to, at least, okay? Has it helped out the economy? Has the economy improved in China today? Yes. It's got one of the biggest economies in the world, right? Is that directly related to the one-child policy?
No.
There may be other factors that have contributed to it, okay? But with that said, their economy is much, much better today than what it used to be. It's one of the, again, largest economies in the world. It's projected to surpass the United States and become the largest economy in the world fairly soon. If not, now it's within the next 5 years or so. It's projected to surpass our GDP, okay? In the 1970s, though, the fertility rate was about 5 children per woman. 5 children. No, thank you. That's not what you're looking forward to, Miss Avery? 5 children per woman. And again, that's the result of Mao's policy. Mao wanted large families, right? So again, if we were going to take immigration out of the equation, nobody's moving in, nobody's moving out of a particular country, how many children per family do you need to have to maintain one population? Not increase it, not decrease it, but just keep it the same. 2, right? You gotta have 2. And it's really 2.1 because you're going to have some infant deaths. That's understandable. It's just, on average, it's 2.1 to compensate for infant deaths. But 2 is relatively close. Okay? Today, the fertility rate in China, so it was 5. Now it's 1.69. Last year it was like 1.58. So it's gone up just a little bit over the past year, but it's under 2. So again, if you take immigration out of the equation, what should happen to the Chinese population over a long period of time?
Decrease.
It should decrease. It's below 2. It's below 2. If you rank them concerning fertility rates and compare them to other countries in the world, of the 230 countries, they're ranked 185. So they're down there at the bottom. Okay, I looked at another statistic. They only had 180 countries in that group of list, and they were down at like 165 of the 180. So on the bottom, like 15. There. Sound good? So their population growth should slow. Other countries down there at the bottom, Japan, they don't even have to. They don't implement the one-child policy. They have issues with fertility rates. Ironically, Portugal, close to Spain, very low fertility rates. Croatia, Ms. Doris is from, very low fertility rates there as well. Okay? How was the policy implemented? So this is actually prior to the implementation of the one-child policy in the 1970s. They tried something else out. They call it late, long, few, or long, late, few. And essentially, late and long, they encourage parents to wait a long time before having their children, right? So instead of becoming parents in your early 20s, then you need to wait longer until your 30s, right? Before you start having children, okay? So that was one part of the policy. When you had children, the government was encouraging families to separate the children by lots of years. Don't have them back-to-back years. Don't have them every other year. Have them every 4th year or every 5th year, right? Put a lot of space in between them. And they thought that would slow population growth. And then all together, don't have 5, just have 2 or 3, okay? The government was trying to encourage it that way. The problem is, when they tried this approach, it didn't work, right? The government was encouraging people to, follow these policies. It wasn't slowing things down, so they had to get a little bit more extreme, okay? So, in 1979, that's when the one-child policy was implemented. You may want to put an asterisk next to 1979. That's a key test question you may want to take note of. 1979, the year in which the policy was implemented. Same year of the Iranian Revolution. You guys remember that one? They were overrunning the embassy in Tehran. Americans hostage, 555 days. Same year. A lot of stuff going on there. The policy, the idea, when you talk about population control, the terminology is really eugenics. And it really didn't originate. The idea of this eugenics idea didn't come from China. It was really a thesis paper from this guy in Western Europe. And there was a delegate from China in Western Europe going to some conference or something like that. And he happened to run into this guy that had written this thesis on eugenics and population control. And so this Chinese delegate, asked to see it, reads through the paper, and then takes the idea back to China. And it was never implemented over in the Western world, but the idea then became the one-child policy in China, right? It took off in China. So it's almost by accident that the Chinese government came across the idea, okay? So how was the policy implemented? If you live in an urban area, you're allowed 1 child. If you live in a rural area, you're allowed 2 children if the first one is a female. So we've got to differentiate urban from rural. What is an urban area? Urban. Ms. Oaks?
Like in the city?
The city. If you live in the city, you're only allowed 1. Doesn't matter whether it's male or female. You're allowed 1. If you live in the rural areas, what's the rural area then, Ms. Oaks?
In the country.
Yeah, the country. You can have 2 if the first is female. Why would they allow you to have 2 if the first is female in a rural area? Tyler?
Like help on the farm.
Yeah, it's an agricultural lifestyle, right? So it's all about labor in that type of environment. If you have 2 females, that's it. You're done. You can't have another one. Okay. So, yeah. What if you have quadruple? So there's some interesting scenarios, and we'll talk about those here in just a minute. But the policy went from 1979 all the way up to 2016. So do they have the policy today, the one-child policy? No. They've got a little bit of a variation of it. It's really become the 2-child policy. Okay? So you're allowed to have 2 children today rather than 1. And the government and a lot of economists, sociologists, when the change was put into place, they thought that everybody would just jump on board and say, hey, yeah, we're going to have 2 children now, right? But what they didn't anticipate was the cultural, social influences, right? They grew up in a cultural, social environment where there's only 1 child, and that's happened for a couple generations now. So when they become parents, what do? Yeah, they just replicate what they saw in the previous generation, so they only have 1 child as well. So it hasn't increased as much. It hasn't gone back to 2 children. Their birth rate hasn't increased as much as they had anticipated. The cultural, social forces are playing a key role here in keeping the fertility rate down. Okay. In the 1980s, when they first implemented the policy, it was not excusable for you to say, hey, I didn't know, right? I didn't know what was going on, and you had your 2nd child. That wasn't justification. Everybody was on the same page, okay? And if you violated the policy, there was consequences, okay? Initially, some of those consequences could probably be classified as human rights violations. Later on, it's more of monetary fines in their extremes, like $50, right? It's thousands, and it's really contingent upon how much you make, depending upon your own income there, okay? So everybody was responsible. Everybody had to be on the same page. So this is the most common consequence if you violate the rule, okay? It says the fine for having extra children is known as the social maintenance fee. Mr. Hay, a source from China, estimates that the government has collected over 2 trillion yuan, $314 billion in such fees since 1980. Failure to pay means that the second black child cannot obtain a household registration document, which brings it with it basic rights such as education. So that means that the second child can't go to school, right? If you don't pay the fee. And we know the educational system in China is very competitive. Your occupation is contingent upon the test scores that you have in school, how well you do in school. What's the likelihood of that child succeeding if he can't go to school in the first place? Life's going to be difficult for that one, right? So, you had to pay the fee if you wanted to go to school. The amount of the fine varied from place to place. A husband and wife in Shanghai will pay about $17,300, 3 times the city's average annual post-tax income for a second child. The fine increases with income. The rich can shell out millions to have a second child. Okay. When it got to the early 2000s, there were reports that some families that were wealthy, they wanted a second child, and they would willingly, they anticipated it. They saved up for it so that they could have a second child. Now, was that everybody? Not everybody, but there were some exceptions where some parents wanted to do that. So they would willingly pay the fine that way, pay the fee. Now, early on, there was probably some more harsh or harsher penalties for violating the policy. For example, there has been documented forced sterilizations taking place. For example, if the government knows that you already have 1 child and now you're in the hospital giving birth to a second child, what would happen is the government would force the doctors to perform a procedure on the woman while she was there, and this would be without her consent, so that she would not be able to have another child thereafter, right? So you get reports of that, and the woman is not making the decision herself. You'd say that, well, that's a violation of her rights, right? That way. So you had forced sterilizations taking place. Okay, sometimes that happened after the first child, so that they couldn't even have a second child that way. Okay, sometimes it would be forced abortions. The government realizes that you've already got one child and you're pregnant with your second child. Sometimes they would force the woman to have an abortion on that second child there. Okay. Unintended consequences of the implementation of the one-child policy. So the ultimate goal was to decrease population growth. Sometimes you don't think about other things that are going to happen that you just can't anticipate, okay, or you don't think about. So unintended consequences. Ultimately, what you had was a large number of elderly because of previous generations, and then a decreasing number of young workers, and an inadequate social welfare system. Okay. So in China, in a lot of Southeast Asian cultures, the cultural expectation is that the younger generations will take care of the older generations as they age. Okay? So when the one-child policy is implemented, it makes it really important that you have a male rather than a female. Everybody wanted to make sure that they had a male. Because if you had a female, and that female eventually marries, whose family does she go with? She goes with her husband's family, right? So if you're a parent and you have a female, or you're a grandparent and your children have a female, is there anybody there to take care of you? No, culturally that social welfare is not there. So they call it the 4-2-1 phenomenon, meaning that you have 4 grandparents. Those grandparents both have one child. They marry, so there's 2 on the second generation. They marry, they only allowed to have one, so that's the one down at the bottom, 4-2-1. Sound good? Again, that's a lot of social economic pressure on the one child down at the bottom because they're a lot of times expected to take care of the generations above them. That's 6 people that they've got to economically account for. That's a lot of pressure, right? Tyler?
In China, like when the one-child policy was going on, could you adopt another child or no?
Like if you didn't have any children?
No, if you had one child.
Could you adopt another one?
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know if they would allow that. I would anticipate no, is what my best answer would. Could be the other way, yeah, but I would anticipate no. Yeah. Other unintended consequences, you would have human rights violations and female infanticide, okay? This isn't up there, but with this idea of parents wanting to have a male, early on in the 1980s, you would have these medical equipment, what do they call them, that identifies, you can see the child prior to birth, ultrasound, sonograms, right? Yeah. So what would happen is the parents would go in, and once they found out that it was a female, then they would do what? They would abort the child because they wanted to make sure it was a male, just so that they could secure, have some kind of security later on down the road, and anticipating what would happen years later. So the government decided you don't want that to take place, right? So they really banned and really limited sonograms, ultrasounds, right? So they locked them up in these hospitals. Nobody could gain access to them because they didn't want people finding out what the sex of the child was until birth, right? Because it was offsetting male-female ratios, right? It was already starting to do that, okay? So if they found out that the child was female, sometimes, this is probably a little bit more exceptional, but the parents, they would leave the child to die of exposure sometimes because they wanted to have a male, right? So that, again, the social pressure playing a role there, okay? You get discrimination against women. You get this idea of question, is it a human rights violation, taking the right to reproduce away from people? There's the other idea, the bare branches. You think about family trees, right? You guys probably done family tree stuff before, but you know how they branch off, right? Well, if you get, you know, a male who eventually, there's a society where there's not as many females as males, and so they can't find a mate, they can't find a partner, they can't find, you know, somebody to procreate with. So if they can't pass down their genes to the next generation, do they have another branch on the tree? No. So it becomes a bare branch. It stops. Right? So what happens in the society if you have too many males? Because that's what's happening in China. There's large cultural implications. The birth ratio, this was a couple years ago, 1.13. What that implies is that there's 113 males for every 100 females. Now, the average birth rates or sex rates for most cultures is, you know, 1, right? So there's 100 females for every 100 males, okay? But in China, it was off. And I've heard statistics that is as high as 130 males for every 100 females, right? And then in addition to that, what that does is that means that there's going to be 30 males in a utopian type of society that are going to be left out. They're not going to have to be able to find, you know, partners, marriage partners, right? To procreate. Inevitably, it's going to happen, right? So there's your bare branches. The other thing that's contributing to it is there's other aspects of culture and society in China today that's taking the limited number of females that are there. They're not wanting to get married at all. So that's even decreasing. That's decreasing the number of available women to marry even more. So there's this new culture of singleness found in China today. Okay, so birth rates are going to decline because of that. Okay, ultimately, I mean that's initially what they wanted, but they don't want the unintended consequences that go with it. Okay. Culture has a tendency to become conservative when there's more males than females. They have a tendency to be very collectivistic. If you think about, you know, what's going on in China today with the government in Beijing, very conservative. Men have a tendency to compete for good jobs. That's a good thing. Fancy cars, that's a good thing, right? Because they're trying to increase their level of attractiveness for the few females that are out there. The downside, they do have some women abductions, and that's not only inside of China, but that could be outside of China. Surrounding countries, trafficking will take place. They'll go outside of China, and then they'll bring women in as potential mates for Chinese men. Okay? We're going to think for a second, well, what happens if the opposite happens? Now, this isn't going on in China, but what would happen if there was too many females? More females than males? What would be the cultural implications here? You would have lower living standards for women. So it's a good thing. Higher standards of living for women whenever you have too many males. But when you have too many females, living standards decrease for females. You'd have a more liberal type of society, high rates of rape, violent crime, and assault. All right? So the idea is that the opposite's happening now in China. Right? We have actually seen this in the United States before. This context where we have more females than males. Happened after World War II. World War II, you have all these young men go off to war. Right? Many of them don't come back. Right? Many deaths. And so there's an influx of females. It creates a more liberal type of society. If you think about the 1960s, it's a very liberal type of society that was going on in American culture at that point in time. Think about the counterculture movement, different types of other movements going on. Very liberal type of society in the 1960s. Sound good? All right. Any questions about the one-child policy in China?